Hi friends, today I want to tell a quick story about my travel to the US last week. I actually got to go back last week for visa reasons. I took a holiday and I got asked both in the States and in Japan what's the difference in the process in both countries for flying in and flying out. And so I thought I'd just kind of simplify it and talk about it in this video. But to put it shortly, the process is completely different. The US process is very easy and minimal checks. The only strict part about the US is that you take a PCR test 24 hours before your flight to the US from Japan. And so that was kind of a pain in the butt and expensive. The PCR test was about $250, but and when getting on the plane, they would have a bunch of, not a bunch, it was a few paperworks that you had to fill out while on the plane so that you could hand it to someone at the airport on the other side. But as soon as you got off the plane on the other side, it was free for all. There's no quarantine measure, at least for Virginia, where I was heading back. There's no quarantine measures, so I just kind of went through immigration normally, got through baggage claim, and then no one asked me for my PCR test or documentation. And so I guess I just kind of threw it away. This was kind of similar to the process 2 years ago. I actually went back to the States 2 years ago too, back in 2020, where they had even more documentations that I had to fill out then when flying from Japan to the US. But again, no one asked me for anything. And so I just threw away in the dumpster right outside baggage claim after asking security if I had handed it into someone. They just shrugged, and so I was like, oh, okay. But at least this time around, they strictly required masks while in the airport. So that was the biggest difference I felt from 2 years ago, even though it was still COVID. But yeah, and then I just went home, no worries, took an Uber. It was great. Now, coming to Japan, very, very different, very strict, and I guess it could be a pain in the butt. At least you feel safer knowing they're taking these very rigorous precautions. But if I go into too much detail, it could drag on very longly. So to make it shorter, I guess the first step before getting on the plane, you have to take a PCR test. But this one only needs to be 72 hours, so 3 days before your flight. So that was a lot easier, and I was really grateful for that. Still expensive PCR tests in the States, so like $250. And then at the ticket booth, at the ticket counter, I was requested to show the questionnaire that I was supposed to fill out beforehand and make a QR code for, which I wasn't paying attention properly, so I missed out on. And so already they were having things needing to be filled out or done before getting on the plane. And then on the plane, there are many documentations that were being handed out that I had to read through and sign. And yeah, and at the airport on the other side, that in itself is a whole process. My cousin who went back, it took them like 4 hours apparently, 3-4 hours. For me, I got lucky. It only took about 2.5 hours maybe to do the whole process. But throughout the airport, it's just very isolated, and they have all these booths throughout the long terminal where they go through each of your documentations to check. Oh, initially, the first thing they do is they do a PCR test where you have to spit in a little test tube, and they will check the results for it later on in the process. But then you would go to each booth to check all of your documentations, your questionnaires, your general information. And then there was a section too where they required you to download 2 applications that you have to have on at all times on a smartphone. And so they would then make sure you had those on, make sure your phone was in the right settings so you get the notification. And if you don't have a smartphone, they would rent one out to you. The two applications, one of them is kind of a government one just to kind of check and be able to notify you instantly if there was a positive case and if you were in contact with an individual who was positive. But the other one, this was a SOS one, which is really strict. This is an application they use throughout the quarantine period. For me, it's currently 7 days where they would call you and you have to FaceTime for 30 seconds with an AI and also on occasion, I have to press a button to notify that you're where you're supposed to be throughout the day. It can happen like 3-4 times a day, but that's the kind of application you have and that you are required to download. And the staff at one of the booths kind of make sure you understand how to use. And after you do that process, you sit down and you wait for your results, which was probably the longest process. I probably waited for like 40 minutes, but anyway, assuming you weren't positive, assuming you were negative, they then shuttle you to a hotel, which is a whole nother process. Very tedious, but they would check you into a airport hotel and then you get quarantined there for 3 days. Well, at least for me, it was 3 days coming from Virginia in the US, but certain states or countries, they require 6 days out of the 7-day quarantine. And luckily, the hotel that you stay in that's directed by the government is all free, and the food, they give you breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day free. But you're just isolated in that room, can't leave for any reason. They're very strict about it too. There's an internal announcement every day. There's about, I think, like 6. There's 2 in the morning, 6:30 and 7, to notify for those leaving that day that they'll be preparing COVID tests right outside your room. So be prepared. And then the other 6 times, so total 8. The other 222 is for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, where they call you, notifying that they'll be hanging your breakfast, lunch, or dinner outside your door, but please do not open it. And then the second announcement will be to ask you to put a mask on and open the door to grab your food and then go back in right away. And then they had a whole process for like trash and whatever too, but very organized, very strict, very tedious. And then you do that for 3 days and then you could go home. But when you go home, you can't take public transportation. So you have to have someone pick you up, a family member or something. If you don't have that, then you have to stay at a hotel for the remaining quarantine days that has a transportation system. And the airport, very strict, blocking off and having lots of signs stating that if you just flew in, you cannot take any transportations. Anyway, as you could tell from the story, very, very different process flying into US versus flying into Japan. Much more strict in Japan. I mean, in the States, literally get off the plane, go through immigration, and I'm free to do whatever. Versus Japan, from the moment you get on the plane from the state side, you're controlled and directed, and there's a process and operation that's strictly run in an exact method. Quite impressive. But yeah, my 3 days at the hotel ended yesterday, so finally came back, but I still have to be home for another 4 days, I guess. So just gonna wait that out, but thought I'd share that story. Thought it was interesting to compare and contrast the difference, and yeah, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you guys up again in no time.